This paper just came out, and I think it's interesting and relevant for the urban resilience that we have been discussing in this section of adaptation. We have generally claimed that cities, inclusive cities, we wanted green, resilient, and inclusive cities, and we said inclusiveness actually enhances resilience of the urban centers. But this study, based on the U.S. cities, says human mobility networks reveal increased segregation in large cities. So remember, we have had issues with defining cities. Although we did look at small, medium, and large cities and country level incomes to define typographies of cities and so on. So I'm going to just give you a brief flavor by just reading the abstract and the research summary of this paper, which Nature kindly provides. So, long-standing expectation is that large, dense, and cosmopolitan areas support socioeconomic mixing and exposure among diverse individuals. So we are being a little loose here and saying what is large, but dense and cosmopolitan also can make sense, but there are no real numbers being implied here. So you have some sense of what we mean, but at least we're talking about cities. Assessing this hypothesis has been difficult because previous measures of socioeconomic mixing have relied on static residential housing data rather than real-life exposures among people at work in places of leisure and in home neighborhoods. So the title itself tells you that human mobility networks reveal increased segregation. So that kind of data is used to infer segregation as opposed to what has typically been inferred from static residential housing data. Here we develop a measure of exposure segregation that captures the socioeconomic diversity of these everyday encounters, using mobile phone mobility data to represent 1.6 billion real-world exposures among 9.6 million people in the United States. We measure exposure segregation across 382 metropolitan statistical areas and 2,829 counties. So it's very much a US study, but hopefully it also has some implications for cities elsewhere, at least in terms of large, dense, and cosmopolitan urban centers. We find that exposure segregation is 67% higher in 10 largest MSAs than in small metropolitan statistical areas with fewer than 100,000 residents. This means that, contrary to expectations, residents of large cosmopolitan areas have less exposure to a socio-economically diverse range of individuals. Okay, so this is the exposure segregation. That who do you see on average over time? Second, we find that increased socioeconomic segregation in large cities arises because they offer a greater choice of differentiated spaces targeted to specific socioeconomic groups. This includes housing, of course. Third, we find that the segregation increasing effect is countered when a city's hubs, such as shopping centers, are positioned to bridge diverse neighborhoods and therefore attract people of all socioeconomic statuses. Maybe something like malls or parks or other shared public spaces. Our findings challenge a long-standing conjecture in human geography and highlight how urban design can both prevent and facilitate encounters among diverse individuals. So exposure segregation is basically about the mixing of different socioeconomic classes on a regular basis. Whether this amounts to inclusiveness or not, and whether that relates to resilience and so on, are more detailed questions, but I wanted to include this here just because of the way this analysis is done to use mobility networks to infer segregation in large cosmopolitan dense cities. So what is the research briefing say? This is a good way to understand the summary of the paper, because I'm not going to show any of the results from the paper itself. The myth of cosmopolitan cities, why large urban areas are more segregated. I didn't include the DOI link to this paper because the one that is provided is actually not working. But if you find this paper, then you will find this as well, because in the journal they refer to each other. There is a long-standing assumption that large, densely populated cities inherently foster interactions between a diverse range of people. This is generally intuitively thought to be obvious. Analysis of 1.6 billion person-to-person encounters in the United States reveals that big cities are actually pockets of extreme segregation, highlighting a need for strategic urban design that fosters more integrated environments. So the choices are made based on, let's say, immigrant group wanting to live, Chinatown being preferred by Chinese, Little Italy, or black neighborhoods, Korean neighborhoods, Indian neighborhoods, and so on. There is some evidence that this is not really segregation by any diktat. It is just self-selection that happens over time, that immigrants and people of certain ethnicity, religion, etc. choose neighborhoods based on somebody they already know, and then people keep on congregating into the same regions, and soon you have diverse neighborhoods that are pockets of specific cultures, religions, ethnicities. So is that really segregation, or is that self-selection? That's what is the key question. The question, urban environments are growing rapidly. The United Nations projects that by 2050 more than 2/3 of the world's population will live in cities, up from 55% today. Social scientists have long theorized that the rise of large dense cities brings people from diverse backgrounds together. If this cosmopolitanizing effect is real, it might counterbalance the growth in wealth inequality by ensuring that all socioeconomic classes continue to interact with one another. What does this mean, interact? That on a daily basis, outside of work, in a socio-economic interaction, we will talk about agency, action, arenas of action, and so on later on in the sustainability course, but this is what this means. But it remains unknown whether urbanization has this integrating effect, or whether large cities actually facilitate segregation by enabling people to seek out and find others similar to themselves. So this is self-selection. We conduct the first assessment of the relationship between urbanization and the diversity of human-to-human encounters. Okay, so remember that this is a kind of a focused analysis targeted at human-to-human interactions based on mobility networks. So you have to be careful of what it means for the rest of our discussion on urban resilience, greenness, and inclusiveness. The discovery of the study. Our study used mobile phone data from 9.6 million people in the United States to construct a network of 1.6 billion path crossings, events in which two individuals were in the same place at the same time, across 382 metropolitan statistical areas and 2,829 counties, as we said before. We inferred the socioeconomic status of each person from their nighttime location, cross-referenced with the data on rental prices. By linking socioeconomic status to path crossing data at the individual level, our network enables us to develop city and county level measures of exposure segregation, which captures the socioeconomic diversity of the people whom the average resident encounters day to day. Our main discovery is that exposure segregation is higher in large cities than in smaller ones. Again, not being very rigorous in the definitions used. In the 10 largest MSAs, I'm not going to show this figure, in the 10 largest MSAs, it is 67% higher than in MSAs with fewer than 100,000 residents. So there you get the population size. doesn't say the geographical extent, but says something about the density of populations, which is higher in larger MSAs than the smaller ones. We also uncovered the mechanism through which urbanization leads to higher segregation. Large cities offer a greater choice of differentiated spaces targeted to specific socioeconomic groups. Finally, we found that when a city's hub, such as shopping malls, are located between lower and higher income neighborhoods, exposure segregation is greatly reduced because these hubs become meeting places for people from more diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. Yet it's still tricky because in a mall, if people of different socioeconomic classes are occupying the same space, it does mean exposure across socioeconomic classes, but does this mean anything more in terms of actual interactions? That's not so obvious, right? Implications of the study. Our study finds strong, robust associations between key city characteristics such as population size, density, and hub locations on the one hand, and the diversity of human-to-human encounters in a city on the other. The findings highlight the importance of urban design and provide strategies for integrating residential neighborhoods that foster inclusive and diverse urban interactions. Okay, if you're in a mall straddling different socioeconomic classes, then the idea is that they will interact in food places, shopping places, maybe on transportations, parking lots, whatever. Okay, these results challenge the long-standing assumption that big cities are cosmopolitan centers in which diverse populations, diverse people come together and interact. Big cities instead provide the scale needed to support venues that are tailored to clientele of different incomes, meaning that they magnify rather than overcome segregation. This implies that policies supporting high-density cities come at a cost. Strategic urban planning might be able to mitigate this effect. If a city's hubs are accessibly located, they can serve as public meeting places that span diverse communities. This hub-bridging approach provides an important supplement to conventional approaches that aim to integrate residential neighborhoods. In the future, we will assess the causal effect of bridging hubs on everyday segregation. For instance, we hope to understand whether subsidies that incentivize the development of shopping centers located between diverse residential neighborhoods can indeed increase exposure between people of different socioeconomic backgrounds. And for our theme here about urban resilience, it means that such studies also have to then look at whether this increased interaction between different socioeconomic groups will actually lead to enhanced inclusiveness, and whether that leads to measurable increases in urban resilience as well, which is our main theme here in the context of adaptation and resilience building. Right? We were talking about the context of climate change resilience, but if inclusiveness leads to climate change resilience to climate change, then obviously it doesn't matter how it happened. If building malls at certain places as bridging the gaps between diverse groups also leads to inclusiveness and climate resilience, then so be it. Okay, so it's an interesting result. I just wanted to add this at the end here. Rest of the results related to this will probably go in a section called New Findings in Climate Adaptation, which we will look at later. Okay.